His phone lit up in the dim of the church vestibule. The message was 3 words and then nothing else. I can't come. The words arrived like a cold draft that pushed through the lace of her veil and settled in the hollow behind her ribs. Beatriz held the bouquet until her fingers ached, as if the weight of the flowers could anchor the moment, stop the world from tilting. The aisle, usually a measured stride toward promise, became a canyon of eyes. Faces blurred into a single humming mass. The organ lost its tune and turned into a distant clock counting the seconds she had to swallow. She didn't scream. She wasn't cinematic in the way romance novels promised. She stood, palms damp at her sides, and watched her life rearrange itself into paragraphs she hadn't written. Phones rose like tiny lighthouses, screens alight. A murmur, then a ripple, then a wave. Clicks, flashes, whispers threading through the pews. The priest paused, mouth forming a question that dissolved before it reached her. In the front row, Raphael's mother stared with a face the color of porcelain. In the back, someone stifled a laugh. Somewhere near the choir, Julia's hand found hers and squeezed so hard the pain tasted like truth. Then, Rodrigo walked down the aisle. He was not a stranger, never that. He was her boss, an argument away from being an untouchable icon in the company. Rodrigo wore a suit that seemed tailored to make the light cling to him. He moved with the unruffled certainty she had watched from across conference tables, and he smiled without the private calculations she sometimes saw in emails. He paused beside her, words compressed into the small space between breath and breath. Beatriz, he said quietly, as if they were not at the center of a stadium of witnesses. If you like, I'll stand with you. She heard it as an offer, not a command. The sentence was a hand held out in a storm. There were a dozen ways to refuse. There were only a few that would stop the cameras. The first was humiliation swallowed whole. The second was to run and let the night shape the story without her. The third was to take what was offered, and for a moment override the cruelty with a new tableau. She searched for the words. Her throat was a matchstick. Say yes, he murmured. Or don't. It's yours. She said yes, not because she trusted it would fix anything, but because the empty sound of silence felt like a verdict she could not live with. Saying yes became an action against that blankness. She would not let the altar be a place where nothing could be salvaged. They moved through the motions with the economy of people who have rehearsed manner without feeling. The kiss was quick, a courteous punctuation that landed on her mouth like a closed book. Cameras caught each practiced angle. The applause that followed felt thin, like tinfoil confetti. At her side, Rodrigo's palm was steady against the small of her back.
He guided her out of the church with the precise protective choreography of someone who knew how to hold an image until the photographers blinked away. The reception glittered under chandeliers whose light seemed intent on showing every seam. People did their roles, whisperers, sympathizers, the polite who clapped with the precision of those who had memorized grief etiquette. Reporters, real or would-be, hovered at the edges, pen poised, mouths tight. Within an hour, the story had fractured and multiplied. A friend texted a photo with a caption that felt like a verdict: "Bride left at altar, rescue by high-profile CEO." Notifications multiplied. A hashtag began to crawl up feeds. Her name echoed through 1,000 sterile apps. The damage, invisible moments before, found its way into public statements and pixelated gossip. That night, on a terrace that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and lemon candles, under a sky that had nothing to offer her, Rodrigo sat opposite Beatriz, with the city sprawling below like a map of small, indifferent lights. He had taken off his jacket and seemed, for the first time, less like the untouchable boss and more like a man who had decided to intervene. "This will be messy," he said, not looking at her but at a streetlight 4 stories down. "There will be questions. There will be consequences." She laughed, once, thin. "You could have just left me to be a sad headline." He turned then. The city reflected in his eyes as if they were a surface polished for effect. "I didn't want that for you." It wasn't as simple as it sounded. He'd sat through meetings where her proposals were dismissed with a riffle of fingers, watched her labor late nights to correct details no one acknowledged, seen her shrink to make room for others' egos. There was a debt, perhaps, a small account of things he ought to have noticed before the cameras noticed them. Or maybe it was more elemental, an urge to protect that had mutated into a reflex when the world was set to humiliate another human being. There was no single cause to parse, motives braided together like hair. Later, when journalists called, he would smother the story with a practiced hand, release carefully curated photos, and arranged for a statement that framed the night as an unfortunate coincidence turned into a gallant intervention. The narrative, his narrative, would be neat, glossy. Social feeds would move on after a week, but he also knew, in the honest place between his ribs, that no public relations sweep could reclaim what had been laid bare. In the weeks that followed, the damage declared itself in ways that could not be staged away. She had thought the wound began at the altar, but memories rose like old maps. There had been a meeting 2 years ago in a glass-walled boardroom when a senior client dismissed her idea with a flick of his pen as if her work were invisible.
She remembered the flush of heat that crawled up her neck, the way her colleagues' glances slid past her, and the small, practiced smile she offered, as though this would make the world forget they'd ignored her. That tiny, corrosive moment had sat in her like a grain of sand, small, persistent, always irritating. There were nights when she'd rehearse apologies in the mirror. There were mornings when she would alter the way she spoke so as not to jar anyone. The altar only multiplied those small erasures into something like a public scorecard of her worth. Outside of that, there was the last birthday party with Raphael, when a joke too sharp cut more than humor should. He had laughed at her expense in front of his friends, and she had stood on the fringes, applauding because the applause made her less conspicuous. She had swallowed anger, disappointment, and budding distrust because it seemed easier than conflict. Those moments had braided together into a landscape of self-doubt that the cameras could exploit. Once someone casts you as someone who will be left, the world obliges. On the morning after the reception, her phone filled with messages that read like a chorus of benevolent indecency. Old acquaintances wrote to offer support. Strangers messaged photographs of the wedding with comments that ranged from pity to thin curiosity. At work, the whispers nested into the slack spaces of the office, an ambiguous glance in the elevator, a hushed conversation that stalled when she walked by. Her coworker Natalie, who had once teased her about working too hard, now offered hugs that felt like bandages, thin gauze over an artery. The company newsletter, which rarely cared about personal lives, ran a feature on the CEO's supposed chivalry. The column praised a man who stepped into a public role with decisive grace, and in praising him, it framed her as someone who needed rescuing. The subtext was harder to undo, that she had been vulnerable and required a man's intervention to regain public dignity. Rodrigo's interventions had practical benefits. He called legal counsel, an expensive firm whose assistants wore calm expressions, and the lawyers murmured about privacy injunctions and statements that would close off gossip for a while. He arranged for a quiet guest list at some launch events to control the visibility. He offered to speak to reporters and set the tone. When the company PR drafted messages framed to protect Beatriz's image, those drafts read like armor. Yet even the armor had chinks. Every image curated for public consumption suggested there had been an image in need of curation. Every compassionate press line hinted at a prior exposure that had made compassion necessary. Back at her apartment in the small hours, Beatriz opened her mother's old letters tucked in a shoebox under her bed. She read about a younger woman who had been told to keep her head low in a town where voices were expensive and integrity cheap. Her mother's words held the soft sting of passed-down warnings. "Don't let other people's mouths shape how you stand," one line read. It sounded, in the quiet, like both advice and indictment. She thought then how many times she had adjusted her shoulders to fit the frame someone else had put around her. The altar had not created those adjustments. It had only exposed them under brighter lights. When she confronted Rodrigo about the costs, what his public intervention would ask of her, his answer hovered between protective duty and an admission of fault. "I don't want you to disappear," he said. "Not into gossip, not into silence. If people need a story, let them have this one. It's better than the alternatives." "Is it better for me?" she asked. He was honest then, in the way people sometimes are when they see another person unclothed by fear. "It's a step," he said, "not a cure. It buys us space to figure out what comes next." The words landed like tempered glass, larger than simple consolation, but not the whole thing. He did not promise outcomes he could not deliver. He did not claim to erase the past. He offered leverage, a public shield fashioned by one of the very systems that had enforced the old wounds. The tension between those facts moved between them like a current. Consent remained a constant undercurrent in their conversations. Whatever the spectacle had demanded, the moments afterward required clarity. When Rodrigo suggested, one evening over a late dinner, that they maintain the persona of a couple for the public eye until things calmed, she looked him in the face and set the terms. "This is not to hide me away," she said. "This is not to erase what happened. If I'm agreeing to this, it's because I'm asking for agency. If at any point I tell you it's over, then it's over." He nodded. "I hear you." He meant it. His eyes were steady. It mattered that she had to give permission, that he acknowledged the difference between a gift and a demand. Julia was another mirror. She sat with Beatriz in the days that followed and did not offer platitudes. "You can't let them frame you as someone who needed saving," she said bluntly, "but you can use what you have to make it stop being about them." Beatriz wondered what that meant exactly. Use him? Use the limelight? Use the story to build new scaffolding? There was a grim comedic aspect to the idea that to reclaim yourself, you might have to borrow someone else's spotlight. But the spotlight was one of the few tools that could reorder the narrative. Rodrigo's name carried weight. His statement that he would stand by her meant, in practice, that rumors would be checked, that invitations might spread in her favor, that tabloids could be diverted. There was power in association. There was also risk. Association could become a cage if she allowed it to define every step she took thereafter. Not everything fit into strategies.
There were private nights when she replayed the moment Raphael's message arrived. She would ask the same questions in different languages. Had she missed signs? Was the hunger for approval something she could starve? The answer was never neatly concise. The damage that had been done over the years, small erasures, whispered dismissals, choices to collapse for the comfort of not confronting, couldn't be fixed with a press release or a staged kiss. It required a long, stubborn work of reconstructing a self that was more resistant to being made small. Publicly, the story transformed into a manageable arc. There were curated photographs of them smiling on a rooftop, claims of a mutual decision to reframe the evening. Rodrigo, in interviews, used the language of responsibility. "No one should experience that," he said in one recorded exchange. "I stepped in because it was the right thing to do." He did not call her broken. He did not fix her. Yet the narrative knitted itself into palatable shapes: rescue, chivalry, a scandal tempered by human kindness. Yet private costs mounted. Her family, who had watched the televised snippets with the aching attention of those who loved her, needed explanations she could not yet fully give. Her mother held her hand, every line on the older woman's face a question. "Did you want this?" she asked. Beatriz told half-truths and guarded ones. "I wanted to stop being alone in the moment," she said. The words were neither noble nor shameful. They were true. Her father, less verbal and more practical, loved her enough to be furious on her behalf, but unsure how to channel that fury into help. In the living room later, her mother quietly suggested that they should set a boundary, that Beatriz should reclaim what had been exposed, that they start small, public statements of her own, selective interviews, slowly rebuilding professional credibility, things that required a slow, procedural courage. There was resistance at work. Some colleagues whispered that she had asked for a favor. Others, who had always been polite, now seemed to measure her against the version of her that appeared in glossy spreads. It was as if image adjusted reality. The photograph did not always capture nuance, and the caption rarely did justice to the cost behind the eyes. A week after the altar, a column appeared, an op-ed about power and performance in the age of spectacle. It criticized an easy, masculine rescue, likening it to a trope where a stronger presence erases another's crisis. The piece stung because it contained an element of truth, that sometimes rescue can be a balm that also reinforces the same hierarchies that caused the vulnerability in the first place. Beatriz read it in the quiet of her kitchen, coffee gone cold, and felt a strange relief. Someone had named the texture of the problem she had been circling. The op-ed did not provide warmth, it offered a mirror. There were other mirrors too, smaller, more private.
A group chat thread pings with a message from an old mentor who reminded her of her skill, citing a past project and the role she had played. Messages like that became incisions that healed in small ways, reminders that she existed beyond the story the news outlets told. Her work began to regain color when she reclaimed little spaces, a presentation that was unapologetically hers, a client meeting where she held the room with the exacting force of facts rather than nervous deference. She started to sit forward in chairs that used to swallow her. Rodrigo noticed, not as patronizing observation, but as something that recalibrated his respect. The dynamic between them shifted into a tentative partnership, fragile, threaded with unspoken gratitude and a cautious awareness of boundaries. They negotiated public appearances, sometimes agreeing to turn down invitations that felt like charades. The more she stood for herself in small daily acts, the less her identity tethered to his shadow. Still, the damage that existed before the altar required more than courageous meetings and sharp presentations. It required therapy sessions that she began to book in the weeks that followed. The therapist's office smelled of coffee and lemon oil. The sessions were small excavations, stories of childhood, of being taught to apologize for space, of learning to be invisible to survive. Naming these patterns felt like taking inventory of old debts. There were nights when Beatriz sat with her therapist and cried for the expectation that she should always be pleasant, always small, always forgiving. There were moments of astonishment, too, when she realized how many decisions she had made from a place of not wanting to be seen as burdensome. When she finally made a decision in front of her mother and Rodrigo, on a rainy Sunday under the skylight of her parents' kitchen, the words were simple and exacting. "I'm not marrying him," she said, of Raphael, though he was already gone. "And I'm not erasing what happened." Her mother's hands trembled slightly, but then closed around hers in a grip that spoke of love without solution. "Then we will stand with you while you decide what you want," her mother said. "We won't tell you to hide. We'll tell you to be brave." The question that formed like a dark, slow stone at the bottom of everything was whether to keep the public charade indefinitely. Rodrigo continued to offer the possibility of a maintained public story, an alignment that could keep gossip at bay. He was clear that if she ever wanted to stop, his support would not be a ransom. "I'll step back," he said, "but stepping back doesn't erase what you've been through." Beatriz thought of all the small apologies she rehearsed for the world. She thought of the office where she'd learned to laugh a little quieter, the friends who had watched her modify herself to fit in. She thought of the terrace that first night, the city with its indifferent lights.
And she thought of the moment at the altar, less a beginning, more a revelation. The damage had existed long before Raphael's message. The cameras had only amplified what was already there: patterns, histories, expectations that had made it possible for someone to be left alone in front of an audience. On a particular evening, not long after the rain-sanded decision in the kitchen, Rodrigo took her to a small square loft where he liked to work when the city was tolerable. There were books on the shelf, a few plants bent toward the light, and 2 cups of tea that had gone cold. He did not wear his armor of CEO there. He was less a symbol and more a man who seemed to want to be honest. "If you choose to keep me in the public story," he said, "I will not let it define you. I will treat it as a tool, not a shield to hide you behind." She looked at him and understood, in a terse, aching way, that accepting his help would not be a surrender if she made it so. Acceptance could be an act of strategy, not of defeat. She could borrow his influence for a time and use it intentionally to buy breathing space, to rebuild the parts of herself that had been hollowed. To do that, she would need to remain fiercely sovereign over the terms. She would not give her narrative away. She would not permit the gesture to become a substitute for the labor of healing. "Then we'll do it on my terms," she said. "We build it together, but I decide." He nodded. There was relief in his face, and something like admiration. For a moment, without the audience, they were 2 people negotiating the boundaries of assistance. Consent kept surfacing in small, concrete ways. Publicly, they agreed on what photographs would be released, how interviews would be framed. Privately, they set words for touch and closeness, making sure that whatever they shared in quiet spaces would be based on agreement, not obligation. The first time they kissed again in privacy, it was slow and cautious and entirely mutual. There was no rush there, only the negotiation of desire and the understanding that proximity must not be mistaken for possession. Still, even with those arrangements, the world continued to complicate the notion of healing. At a charity gala some weeks later, a columnist cornered Beatriz with a camera and an eager list of questions. "Do you regret how it happened?" the woman asked. Beatriz could have flinched, could have let the question force a confession to fit into a neat sentence. Instead, she chose a line that had been gathering in her. "I regret that it took that moment for me to see the places I had already been hurt, but I don't regret the fact that I chose to stand and look." The columnist's pen stilled, perhaps disarmed by the lack of a tidy soundbite.
Reporters are trained to prefer the clutch of scandal to the long work of repair. News cycles love tidy arcs: fall, rescue, redemption. But life is not a cycle so much as a series of overlapping maps, each with its scars.
She learned to tolerate the frustration of being represented by headlines that simplified what she was living. Months passed. Beatriz started to speak at small panels about workplace culture, drawing on her experience with humility and anger. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a witness and a worker of change. People listened. At some events, the applause felt less like pity and more like recognition. Her professional standing reconstituted itself, not because of one staged night, but because of the steady accumulation of her presence, her insistence on being seen without simplification. Rodrigo remained an ambiguous figure. He was kind and culpable, protective and flawed. He had made a choice to intervene. He carried with him the social capital that could steer conversations. He did not try to own her narrative. That was crucial. Yet the fact of their public association meant that some would always imagine more: a romance baked into a rescue, agency surrendered for security. Those assumptions vexed her. They would be stubborn. They had always been stubborn when it came to women who accepted help from men in public spaces. The night she decided, finally and concretely, to unbind the thing that had been hastily tied on the altar for the press, she did not do it with fanfare. She invited Rodrigo to meet her at a small bench that overlooked the river, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered coins. The air was thin, and the night was honest. Her parents were there earlier, having handed her a bundle of old photographs and a little book of their own early letters. She carried the book in her bag like a charge. "I don't want to keep living under the shadow of that moment," she said. "It was real. It hurt. But I am refusing to let it be the thing that decides how I move forward." Rodrigo listened. He understood, in those careful, watchful ways, that people who have power can sometimes practice empathy without possessiveness. "If you want to step away from the public story," he said, "I'll help manage that. If you want me in it as an ally, I will be careful. I won't make decisions for you again." She smiled in a manner that was both tired and resolute. "Neither will I let the past define me." They stood then, hands close but not yet clasped. The city breathed around them, indifferent and faithful at once. Beatriz lifted her hand and placed it in his. It was not a surrender, nor a vow. It was a deliberate bridging of two realities: the protection a name can offer, and the inner work that needed tending. She did not look to him for salvation. She looked to him as a companion who agreed for now to walk part of the road. As they walked back toward the car, her mother called from a bench where she had lingered to watch the river. "Beatriz," she said, "remember, this is your story, not theirs." She didn't realize then, in the bright, shaken days of the altar, that the damage had been accumulating like rain in a gutter, slow and persistent. The act of being rescued had not healed the leaks. It had only stopped the immediate flood. The things that had hollowed her, years of minimizing herself, of laughing soft so others would not be threatened, of shrinking to make room, those required patient, sometimes painful labor. Acceptance of help was only the first item on a long checklist. But the hand in hers, in that small shared moment by the river, felt like a promise that she could choose her path forward. She was not returning to the person who had adjusted herself to fit other people's frames. She was a woman who had been exposed and had decided, deliberately, to contend with what the exposure had revealed. She would take the world's offers of help when they honored her terms. She would refuse scripts that turned her into a lesson or a trophy. She would speak when she had to. She would sit with discomfort when it demanded growth. In the weeks that followed, the feeds quieted. The hashtag slowed. People moved on to fresher spectacles. The quiet, stubborn work continued. She attended therapy and meetings. She rebuilt professional relationships, sometimes falling back into old patterns and then correcting course. There were days when she woke with a heaviness that reminded her how long some repairs can take. There were other days, clean and bright, when she stood in a meeting and felt the precise joy of being heard.
The city did not change for her. Only her relationship to its arrangements shifted. She learned the difference between being rescued and being supported, between a public gesture and inner repair. When she thought of the night in the church now, it did not glower over her like a verdict. It sat there as a moment of truth, a spotlight that revealed not just a single incident, but the seams of a life she could choose to mend. She had been saved from one kind of humiliation, but the truth was that the damage had been done long before the cameras arrived. The rescue was an interruption, not a cure. She accepted help, negotiated terms, and faced the work ahead with a new stubbornness. Holding Rodrigo's hand at the bench by the river was not capitulation. It was a pact to move forward with agency, accompanied by someone who had chosen to stand beside her. The ending was not smooth. There were still stitches to be sewn, but there was movement, deliberate, messy, and entirely hers. If you found yourself in Beatriz's place, what would you do? Would you accept the shelter and make it temporary? Would you rebuild from within? Share your thoughts below, and if these kinds of stories speak to you, stay with the playlist for more tales of imperfect rescues and the long, honest work that follows.